Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you had a good weekend. And today we're going to be discussing one of the aspects of crime scene reconstruction, which is blood pattern analysis. Now, there are many areas of forensics, of criminalistics, will contribute to our intent to try to reconstruct what happened at the scene of a crime. In what order did events take place that led to the crime being committed? What can that show us about the way in which the crime was committed? And what can it then tell us about who was there, who might have been responsible, for example? So crime scene reconstruction involves the observation, evaluation of many different types of physical evidence. It will have to incorporate witness statements, for example, and any other physical evidence that may be present. And ultimately, someone has to attempt to take all of the information input by all the different experts, medical examiner, criminalist, etc., in an attempt to form a story, a hypothesis about the sequence of events that took place at the scene of a crime. One aspect of that is the analysis of blood spatter, because blood is very frequently shed at the scene of a violent crime. And there are various, as we'll hear, there are various ways in which it can be shed. And there are certain characteristic patterns which apply to blood that is liberated from a body and impinges on surfaces and everything around in the crime scene. There are experts who specialize in blood spatter analysis. But I would add one caveat to this. The heyday of blood spatter analysis has passed, because it began to be realized when studies were done that blood spatter analysis is subject to considerable amount of subjective interpretation. And we are trying always to adhere to strict scientific principles. And it appears that, in fact, the error rate on interpretation of blood spatter analysis is quite high. And for this reason, the FBI, for example, has advised that while blood spatter analysis can inform, it should not be really made the basis of hypothesis about how and who was involved with a crime, who was involved with the crime and how they were involved, I should say. So with that said, blood spatter can still give us a lot of information, but we always have to bear in mind that our interpretation is rather more subjective than analysis is for various other aspects of forensic science. So in general, when blood is liberated from a body, it is liberated by violent means. And the pattern that it forms, that the blood forms on surfaces around the source of the blood, can actually lead us back and enable us to construct a sequence of events. The blood-stained patterns are going to be deposited on all surfaces, can be deposited on all kinds of surfaces around the floors, walls, in the bed, on objects, on people. And if they're carefully interpreted, they can suggest to us the direction from which the blood originated. And that's point number one. They can tell us, if we, for example, look at a surface with blood spatter on it, those droplets can be analyzed to tell us the angle at which a blood droplet struck a surface. And by working backwards, we can actually get an idea about the location or the position of the source of the blood, the victim, at the time that that wound was inflicted. Remembering that at a crime scene, at a scene of a violent crime, there may be multiple locations. The person may move around rapidly and be hit several times or shot several times. And the fact that each time one of those blows, for whatever the source of the blow, takes place and produces its own spatter, may enable us to actually work out how an idea of how the people involved moved within the crime scene. So there's a lot of potential information that is contained in blood spatter, but it has to be very carefully analyzed. So we can work out how the movement of the bleeding individual. We can work out the number, if the source is blows, we can work out the approximate number of blows that resulted in the wounding. We can certainly work out if gunshots were involved, we can work out the number of gunshots and the direction that the gun was pointed, etc., etc. And very importantly, it can let us have sometimes work out an approximate location for the perpetrator who is inflicting the wounds. Okay, so let's just have a look at the different kinds of blood spatter that we might see. The first are called passive blood stains, and these are blood stains which result from the action of gravity on a source of blood. So, for example, blood on a knife drips off and falls. That is a passive blood stain. So is blood which is flowing out of a victim and flowing out and coming under the force of gravity. That might take the form, so these passive blood stains can take the form of a series of drops. They may demonstrate flow patterns, which we'll refer to again in a while. The blood will flow down in the direction of gravity. And in the case of somebody who's actively bleeding, say lying down, they would produce a pool of blood, which may contain its own information, as we'll see in a minute. Now, so those are all the passive blood stains. There's one thing to be said about this passive blood staining, and that is very frequently it's not only the victim who is wounded at the scene of a crime, and these passive blood stains may sometimes arise, for example, from a perpetrator who has inadvertently wounded themselves and then moves away from the crime scene and leaves a drip pattern behind. This can commonly happen, for example, in the case of stabbings, things like this. In the violence of the act, the perpetrator may wound themselves. A drip trail leading away from a crime scene like that can indicate a direction that the perpetrator left, but also may leave behind blood which belonged to the perpetrator. And that can be very, very important in identification. In interpreting blood at a scene, it always has to be borne in mind that there may be more than one source of blood. So that may complicate matters, especially as far as identification is concerned. The next set of blood stains are more frequent. These are the projected blood stains, and these result when force is applied to a source of blood. The way we would, in most cases, think of it, a victim is struck in some way. Now, there are different ways of striking people. You can strike with a blunt object. You can strike with a fist. You can strike with a weapon, a blunt weapon. You can strike forcibly with a knife in stabbing, or they can be struck with a bullet. In all of these cases, it is possible to break blood vessels and force blood out of the body and have it projected in a pattern. So the projected blood stains are blood stains, patterns that arise when you apply force to a source of blood, the victim. We recognize three kinds of impact. Low impact, which would probably be something like a fist. High, medium impact, which might be something like with a weapon, but that could also be low. Or high impact spatter. Now, these gradations, as I'll show you in a minute, are not necessarily that useful, because any assault, any attack with a weapon, with a fist, weapon, whatever, can in fact incorporate all three. It depends on the nature of the attack. We would associate high impact patterns largely with a gunshot, but even a gunshot can produce some impact spatter that looks like low. We can have low, mainly we would associate low and medium impact with physical assault, and yet while this is true that they mostly produce low and medium impact, they can in fact also produce high impact spatter. So there's not a clear-cut distinction. An attack like this produces low, an attack like this produces medium. Any attack can span all three, but there may be a higher proportion of high impact with a gunshot than there would be with assault with a weapon like a fist or a log or something like that. So there's two other kinds of projected blood stain which can be really important in reconstruction. And the one is if an artery of a victim is cut. Our blood pressure is really high. If you sever an artery, the blood can be projected from that artery for a considerable distance, a major artery, several feet away from the victim, and it produces a characteristic fountain-like smear, which I'll show you in a minute. The other is that very frequently, if the face is badly damaged, the throat is badly damaged, or if there are chest wounds, anything like that, the person still breathing will breathe out a mist of blood droplets. And that produces a characteristic misting of expiratory blood. So expiratory blood is blood that is blown out of the mouth. Okay, the last set are very important if they are present. They're not necessarily always present, even at the scene of a violent crime. But these are transfer or contact blood prints, blood stains. And these would be things like where somebody has stepped in blood and then walked away and left imprints in blood. The direction in which somebody is walking, or sometimes maybe somebody has put their hand in blood and moved along a wall, imprinting. The direction can be indicated by the way in which the print becomes fainter and fainter and fainter. It's most dense at its origin, and then it fades as the person moves away, as the printing is moved away. The very, very important set of contact blood stains are if people have left fingerprints in blood. You'll remember from our discussion about fingerprints, and in fact, those are called patent prints or positive prints, and they can be very, very important. So the other kind of transfer print is where inadvertently people brush against a surface with a source of blood, either a hand or maybe clothing that is covered full of blood, and leave a smear on a surface. And that is called a wipe pattern. So blood that falls onto a non-porous surface, the blood droplet tends to retain its shape much better. The way to think about it is this. You can picture a blood droplet flying through the air. If it strikes a smooth surface, then the amount of friction underneath is low, and the blood droplet will tend to maintain its integrity as a single droplet. If you've got a rough surface and you have a blood droplet flying in, you can picture that different parts of the surface will grab onto different parts of the blood droplet, and they effectively pull it apart. So when blood droplets fall onto non-porous surfaces, they tend to disintegrate. And where they fall onto a non-porous surface, they maintain their integrity, and they fall onto a porous surface, they tend to get pulled apart. So there is tends to be less spatter on a smooth, non-porous surface. So just in all of these ideas about blood droplets moving, just picture the droplet itself, and then realize that as it strikes a surface, the bottom of the droplet is going to be subject to friction. It's going to be retarded, and the rest of the blood droplet can carry on moving. Okay, we'll see now that this leads to one very significant feature of blood spatter, and that is that we can tell the direction from which the blood spatter came. And excuse me, we do so because the blood droplets, let me just go back here. When blood is dropped directly onto a surface, when there's no angle, in other words, it's dropped perpendicular, it will form a round droplet like this. As soon as it comes towards that surface at an angle, the shape of the droplet is going to be distorted. The same reason I just told you. The blood droplet comes flying in, and the bottom is retarded by the surface that it hits. So when we have a look here, we realize that this blood spatter came in this direction, that direction like that. Because the blood take the single droplet, this droplet came in, it hit the surface, the bottom of the droplet was retarded, and the top of the droplet carried on moving. And it produces this characteristic tail. It distorts the shape of the blood droplet and produces this characteristic tail. And we know that this came from over here. The source was over here and was flying in that direction there. Not that direction, but that direction there. You'll see also that even for this, which was probably just done experimentally, you'll see that there's slight difference in the angles, right? And they're pointing back. They're pointing back here. Just imagine that this was on a wall. You would see blood in a rayed structure, right? And all of the directions pointing back to a common source. So the first thing to note, we can tell the direction they were flying. The second thing is that we can tell the angle. If we saw that blood drop directly made a round dot, then blood coming at an angle is distorted into an elliptical form, an ellipse like that. And by looking at the shape of that ellipse, we can tell the angle at which the blood struck that surface. The more perpendicular, the more horizontally it comes in, the longer that ellipse. The more vertical, perpendicular to the surface, the more circular that ellipse. So we can tell the angle that the blood was moving. We can tell the direction that it was moving. And this allows us to make a calculation, a back calculation, as we'll see in a minute, that allows us to say approximately where did that blood spatter originate from. Now, there are different kinds of the spatter, just because we see spatter going in one direction, doesn't always imply that that was the only way in which blood was traveling. What I mean by that is, let's just take, applies especially to high impact spatter. For example, a gunshot wound. And this is shown here. Here would be the head of a victim. Here's the gunshot. The gunshot passes through the head. As it leaves the head, it produces spatter, characteristic spatter. We would see the tails all pointing that direction, right? Around here. And we would be able to go back here, even if the victim had fallen away from the wall, we would be able to say, well, the victim was somewhere in this region here, because all of the spatter points back. But you have to be careful, because this is forward spatter there. That is spatter that is caused as a bullet, for example, leaves the body and carries material forwards in the direction of the bullet. But there's also, especially with high impact spatter, there is back spatter. The wound, the entry wound here has also bled, and forces, for example, in a gunshot wound, the gases and everything expelled from the skull in the impact project blood backwards in this direction, and that is called back spatter. And in some ways, back spatter is sometimes turns out to be more important than the forward spatter. And for reasons that should be obvious, somebody was standing here. Somebody stood here and fired this gun. And this back spatter may in fact reach them. And it frequently does. And that actually will mark them and mark their weapon as well with victims' blood. So when we see spatter like this, again, we see it, the projecting back here in that direction, but we have to be sure that what we are looking at, are we looking at back spatter or forward spatter? And the back spatter is usually smaller, and back spatter is much less, it does occur, but it is much less in something in a wounding like a stabbing. But it is commonly associated with high impact velocity, with high velocity, high impact wounding, such as happens with a gun. So this is just to remind you that when we're going to really think about three major ways in which blood spatter can occur. The first is in a beating. It can happen, remember that a fist is a blunt weapon. It's a blunt weapon like any other. So the wounding can take place beating with a fist, beating with a weapon, a blunt object. This blood spatter will arise with stabbing, with a slashing, and with gunshot as well. So we have a range of different woundings that will produce blood spatter. We can't look at blood spatter and just at the blood spatter and say, well, this was just a fist, because it's low impact. Because as I told you, even a gunshot wound will produce some low velocity spatter and some medium velocity spatter. But for gunshots, the predominant spatter that we see would be high velocity. Same with an assault with a blunt object, a fist or whatever, would produce predominantly low and medium velocity splatter. But might also produce some high velocity spatter. So this analysis of low, medium, high velocity, it's really not particularly useful. There are other very clear markers that can tell us that a gunshot produced the spatter, for example. the nature of the gunshot is such that the spatter has characteristic form. So here are we diagrammatically think of the different sources of blood splatter. The impact splatter, that is splatter that results from an object striking a source of blood, a victim. That impact may be a blunt weapon, maybe a fist, but it can also be a knife, or it can be a bullet. So all of those, the spatter that results from the impact of a wounding source on a victim, on the blood source, produces the impact spatter. Cast-off spatter is spatter which arises from a weapon such as a fist, a blunt object, or a knife, something like that, where force is applied with the weapon. And the force is applied, blood is acquired, and then the weapon is rapidly withdrawn. And it's withdrawn sufficiently rapidly that blood is cast off from the weapon. And this is very, very important. This is very important patterning because it can tell us how many blows were used on the victim, for example. And it can also give us a strong indication of where the beating took place. And this cast-off spatter very frequently will be present on walls, very frequently on ceilings as well, and also on anything around, drapes or whatever. This blood spatter, cast-off spatter, can travel far. And its presence and its patterning can tell us a lot about the actual nature of the assault that took place. This cast-off spatter, as I say, most frequent with a weapon, a blunt object, or with something like a knife during a violent stabbing. What I mean, stabbing is always violent. What I mean, well, let me say rather, during an energetic stabbing, you may well have cast off, where the person is frantically stabbed. If they just stab once and leave it, you're not going to have cast off. But if they're repeatedly stabbing and withdrawing, you may well have cast off pattern from the gun. The other two are a result of the physiology of the person who's wounded. And these are the arterial spray spatter that I mentioned before. If an artery is cut, there is sufficient blood pressure to actually spray blood out. If a vein is cut, that is not the case. A venous blood flow is under much lower blood pressure, and it's not under the under the impact of the beating of the heart. So arterial blood is being moved by the powerful beating of the heart, and it's relatively high pressure. So a severed artery, blood will fly out in a jet and produce characteristic arterial spray. Expirated spatter is much more passive. It's from breathing out and carrying droplets away and producing a spat. Both of these from the physiology, really, of the victim. So when we, as I showed you before, when we look at blood, the travel of blood droplets on a surface, we see that they point in the direction that they were traveling. That is clear. But they travel out in a fan shape from the source. So we can actually, if this is a flat surface that we're looking at here, we see the droplets like this. This is much as I described before when we were talking about forward and back spatter. We can draw a line through each of these droplets, and we find that there is an area of convergence. Now remember, this is on a flat surface, right? And looking at these, you also realize that these droplets have come in at an angle, right? They've come in at an angle to the flat surface. So this area of convergence, this point on the flat surface, our source of blood is somewhere between the flat surface and us at right angles. It's somewhere there. I'm gesturing towards my screen. It's somewhere between that convergence and the outside, right? At right angles, almost. It's not absolutely so, but more or less at right angles to that point of convergence. Our source of blood is going to be somewhere in three-dimensional space, in other words, in front of this flat surface. But these blood droplets, the shape, the angle can tell us the direction the blood droplets were flying, and it can tell us the angle that they were flying towards that flat surface. And that will enable us to determine an approximate, it's not by no means certain, but an approximate place in three-dimensional space where the blood droplets originated from. And that will show us where in three-dimensional space the victim was standing. It can also, by the way, show us if it's cast off blood that we're looking at and the person was standing in a place casting off blood. It can also suggest to us where a perpetrator was standing when cast off blood was produced. So the way in which this is done, you usually try and find two surfaces in two dimensions at least, where blood pattern has been produced. These have a look here, have a look there. You see these blood pattern. That's the blood pattern there. We'd have an area of convergence around about here. If we drew lines through, here we go here. That's approximately there. But here is another surface at right angles to that surface. And it's the same story. We can draw lines through here and end up with an area of convergence. And we can work out the angle that the blood droplets hit. We can work out the angle that the blood droplets hit for each one. And we end up with a place in three-dimensional space. They may actually draw these out with string. They would stick string to the wall and to the floor and move these out until they end up with a position where the blood droplets in three-dimensional space, the blood droplets might have originated from. That may be useful information, especially in cases where, for example, assault has moved to different areas, either different parts of the same room, different parts of the same house, or where a body has been moved or removed. This kind of information could be very useful. Now, this becomes very complicated when you're talking about gunshot, because gunshot spatter can be very, very varied. And that is because of the enormous energy that is associated with a bullet. When we will talk about bullets and ammunition at some point, but bullets carry with them a huge amount of energy. And when they hit an object, they dissipate that energy, and it's in dissipating their energy that they cause all the damage that they do, the most of the damage that they do. A bullet leaving a body, we've seen before that a bullet leaving a body actually leaves usually a much bigger wound and will carry out of the victim blood, tissue, all sorts of things, and an explosion of gases which have been carried in because of the bullet itself. Gas is impacted into the wound, but also gases are produced by this tremendous energy being dissipated as the bullet is impeded by friction as it passes through the body. It literally boils. And there's often an explosion of gases outwards to produce that forward spatter. So that in itself can make a gunshot spatter look extremely complicated, and this is typical here. First of all, there is a tremendous amount of tissue and stuff that has been carried out by the wound, blood, but also tissue that has been torn out of the body and flung against the surface. There is fine spatter, which you can see here, and more that again can be traced backwards, but it becomes very complicated because a bullet will often, for instance, tear through arteries, and you may well have artery spatter spray as well. This here, just my interpretation looking at this, and see if you agree with me. We've got different kinds. We have fine spatter here, more or less pointing to an area of convergence somewhere here. I would say somewhere down here. Don't forget that a bullet may, and traveling through, may not actually travel neatly from in a straight line from entry to exit. It wanders through tissue and it emerges at a strange angle and may itself impact at a strange, what looks like a strange destination. That's because bullets start wobbling, especially after they've left the body. If I look at this looks like high impact spatter, the fine spatter there. This here is tissue and blood carried out of the exit wound. And this to me looks very much like the victim flew back and hit against the surface. And they hit here and have actually, you can see that that has produced this pattern around that area of impact. There may also be some arterial spray here. It's very, very complicated, and it's very difficult to interpret. Very, very difficult to interpret. And that is solidly tied to the fact that the bullet carries so much, does so much damage, and carries so much energy with it. Here's a really, I have alluded to this before, but that forward spatter may give us some information. But what we would look for very, very carefully in a suspect or on a suspect weapon is evidence of back spatter. Because very frequently, a gun, for example, when fired, the barrel of the gun, the front of the gun, cools down very, very rapidly relative to the outside. And that actually produces it kind of sucks in air a bit. And that back spatter that we saw before may land passively on the gun, but it may actually also be pulled into the barrel. And a perpetrator they will very frequently clean a gun, for example. They'll clean it carefully and never think to clean inside the barrel. That material entering the barrel is called a drawback. That is a drawback effect. And that has frequently produced evidence which has condemned a suspect. In addition, that back spatter may put blood spatter on clothing. And the spatter may be so fine, it may be so small that the perpetrator just doesn't realize that they have blood, but it is very easily revealed on forensic examination. So all of a suspect's clothing, a weapon, etc., is examined very, very carefully for evidence of back spatter. Cast-off spatter, that is, as I told you before, from a weapon, even a fist, being rapidly moved away from the source of blood before another blow is landed. and it produces these characteristic cast-off patterns, which can inform us number of blows and show where the perpetrator was standing, etc. Drop trails. This is a drop trail here. Now, a drop trail may arise from a perpetrator carrying a weapon away from a scene. This can be laid for a considerable distance. That's important simply because in showing us how the perpetrator may have exited the scene. But drop trails are very carefully examined because they are often, as I've told you, the source is often the perpetrator themselves. This is especially the case where a sharp object has been used or where a blunt object, the fist, has been used. Very frequently, a perpetrator will injure themselves and leave a blood trail. So drop trails or drip trails are very, very carefully examined. They may prove to be extremely important. Arterial spray, I've explained the origin, and they can demonstrate movement of a victim. This arterial spray may continue for a considerable time while the victim is still alive, and they can show the victim actually moving themselves or being moved around a crime scene. And this is a typical pattern here. What has happened is a jet of blood has flown up and struck the surface and then dripped down. Now, they say in your book, I've included it here, they say oxygenated blood tends to be brighter red. You'd really be hard-pressed to tell the difference between arterial and venous blood. It is true, it is somewhat brighter, but the difference is really not that great. So this may be a little bit difficult to see, but this is called a void pattern. And this person obviously has been extremely seriously injured. And this, first of all, have a look there, and there. Can you see that there is a trace of a body? This person has laid on their back. They've been laid on their back and they've bled out. And where their body was pressing against the surface, the blood didn't flow. So it left a pattern around them. And this is called a void pattern. If you came upon a scene of a crime, you'd like this, and it looked like this, there was no victim there, you'd be able to tell a number of things. The first thing is that there was somebody lying here. You might even be able to guess at their size from that void pattern. It was the second thing that you would tell you is this person did not get up and walk away. Okay, this is a considerable amount of blood, and it's from the head region. This person probably bled out from a head injury, and this is passive flow. They have been wounded, fallen, and bled out. So just from this, you've already developed something of a picture of what might have happened. If they are no longer there, somebody picked them up and removed them. Somebody moved them away from this scene, and they've left their imprint behind, and they've left us part, at least, of the story about what happened. We would have to look at other surfaces around, look at blood spray, blood pattern on other surfaces to be able to tell what was this head injury from a gunshot? Was this a head injury from a blunt object? Is there cast-off pattern nearby, or is there back spatter or forward spatter from the gunshot? Even if the victim is not here, their presence is told by the void pattern and then by the blood patterning as well. As people move around, both victim and perpetrator, as they move around a scene, they will very frequently leave behind contact or transfer patterns. as we've said before, these may be very important if they are positive prints, if they're patent fingerprints, like as there are here. But there may also be patterns imprinted from a sleeve, from an object, something brushing against the surface, and those we call a swiped pattern. This is a simple pattern, a simple imprinting. And this may be on any surface. And they can, fingerprints left like this can be resolved on many surfaces, even porous surfaces. Now, the other important thing to note are flow patterns, because when blood flows passively from a source, it obviously flows in the direction that gravity pulls it. And blood flow patterns may indicate to us that if they differ, for example, here, this is somebody, they have been wounded and have bled in that direction there. But look here and you realize there's a blood flow pattern at right angles. Now those two things cannot be resolved from this body having remained motionless. This body had to have either moved under its own volition while it was bleeding, or else been moved. The most likely in this case, it would appear to be that this looks like stabbing, just at a glance, that there was a non-fatal. They were standing upright, bled, and then fell. So the first patterning is when they were upright, and then the second patterning is when they actually fell and blood flowed in that direction. But this bleeding can continue for a considerable amount of time after a person is really dead. And blood flow patterns like this can indicate that a body has actually been lifted and moved or put into a different position to the way it was found. This would be very significant in a case where a scene has been staged, where a victim has been placed to make it look like an accident or a suicide or something like that. And blood flow patterns might indicate that, in fact, the body was in an entirely different position originally. Now, blood droplets on a surface can also be disturbed after they have been deposited. If they're immediately disturbed, then we get a swipe pattern. But if they're disturbed after they have been there for a short while, we get characteristic patterning called skeletonization. As the blood, you just picture, this would be a blood droplet that impacted here. And the edges of it dry. Now, blood is a very complex liquid. It's fluid, obviously, and it's largely water with salts dissolved in it, but also with a high number of blood proteins present, especially in the serum, and then blood corpuscles suspended in that liquid. When a blood droplet dries like this, the proteins in the blood crystallize out around the edges, and they are very tough. That's actually, they form a tough, gluey kind of substance that sticks to the surface. If this blood droplet is then disturbed, the liquid part of the blood droplet can be removed, but it will leave behind a skeleton of the blood droplet, and it can still contain a tremendous amount of information. And this skeleton is actually quite difficult to remove. If a wall is clean and is not cleaned well enough, they may leave behind the traces of blood drops, and we can still acquire all of our information from the skeletonized blood droplet. Okay, so the last little bit, please, will you just read on your own? And this is just a page or two about the about documenting. It's just, I'll show you, it's just two things about setting up a grid pattern or using a ruler method to actually measure the blood droplets and to document them. Blood droplets are very carefully documented with photography, with grids and with scales present. And they, again, as in always in photography, we would have remote, closer, and then close-up photographs so that the blood patterns can be located in the crime scene afterwards. Anyway, read through those on your own. And then there is at the very end of this chapter for you, there is this short movie which describes an interesting case which was solved by blood pattern analysis. And so you can just watch that. All right, and then I will see you then on Wednesday. And don't forget, Wednesday afternoon, we have a live class if you are able to attend.